The only reason why I sometimes shy away from like the words qual and quant is I think they present this like dichotomy that is at least not the full truth, right? I think kind of people then start to think, okay, qual means, talking to people about like fuzzy feelings and this kind of thing, and then doing personas. Whereas quant means, you sit on like billions of data points and you put like graphs and fancy charts out, and you speak in ways that normal people don't understand. Whereas in reality, obviously, you'll know that it's a continuum, right? Like it goes from doing exactly that, talking to people, and being fully kind of descriptive about what you learn. But it goes all the way to what I just spoke about. But there are all these kind of intermediate steps. Yeah, so that's kind of why I prefer to like think about the whole dimension as product insights, because we try to, at the end of the day, understand people so that we can make better decisions for our product, for our business. But I'm obviously very happy to kind of consider qual and quant user researchers as a part of that, and it's all about where on that spectrum do you sit.
Hi, I'm Mike Green, and welcome to Understanding Users, the podcast where I chat candidly with UX design and research professionals from around the world to hear about how they build digital products and services in a user-centered way. So my guest this time is Ben Dressler. And what I wanted to chat to Ben about was quantitative user research. So I'll turn the microphone over to you, Ben, and if you could just introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me. Yeah, as you said, my name is Ben Dressler. I am what I would call myself a product insights generalist. We can get into the definition and why I picked that in a second. But basically, I have a very diverse background. I've done classical user research. I've done, I think, everything up to basic data analysis, data analyst work, and even had like a weird extension or like a stint, you would say, as the experimentation lead at Spotify, and we can talk about what that means. But yeah, it's been an interesting ride.
Kick us off then, Ben, with what is quantitative user research, or product insight, as you rightly call it, and how does it differ from qualitative?
The only reason why I sometimes shy away from like the words qual and quant is I think they present this like dichotomy that is at least not the full truth, right? I think kind of people then start to think, okay, qual means, talking to people about like fuzzy feelings and this kind of thing, and then doing personas. Whereas quant means, you sit on like billions of data points and you put like graphs and fancy charts out, and you speak in ways that normal people don't understand. Whereas in reality, obviously, you'll know that it's a continuum, right? Like it goes from doing exactly that, talking to people, and being fully kind of descriptive about what you learn. But it goes all the way to what I just spoke about. But there are all these kind of intermediate steps. And I also think it's really important, like when you and as someone with a psychology degree, I think you'll definitely also know this or kind of agree to it, is like there are a couple of important dimensions I think that we should consider when you talk about humans, and they are not as easily put aside as like qual and quant. It's very important whether you're talking about, are you using a self-report method where you let people speak about what's on their inside basically, or are you doing an observational method where you're actually kind of looking at what's happening and you're the one basically recording it. Are you interested in something about the attitudes and emotions, or are you interested in behavior that's happening? Then obviously the sample size, really important, right? Are you talking to 5 people? Are you observing 5 people, or 5 million or a billion? That makes a big difference. And I think it's really important that it's fair that we have these shorthands, right? That we have these kind of default methods we fall back to, like discount usability testing, survey with like 1,000 respondents, an A/B test. They have kind of evolved, I think, as these like heuristics almost for a reason. But if you are into the field and you kind of want to like do the best job possible, then I think it's important that you understand some more of those nuances. Yeah, so that's kind of why I prefer to like think about the whole dimension as product insights, because we try to, at the end of the day, understand people so that we can make better decisions for our product, for our business. But I'm obviously very happy to kind of consider qual and quant user researchers as a part of that. And it's all about where on that spectrum do you sit, I think.
But just following on from what you were saying, Ben, what are the sort of key methods that you can use, the key kind of approaches to actually doing a quant study?
Right. So I mean, I can talk about like what I think are generally good tools and good methods, but also like what I use personally. I mean, also just like set the landscape a little bit first. I mean, I think as soon as you're talking about quant in the sense of we want to get numbers that give us more confidence basically around how will this look in a bigger population, right? That's usually when you have to kind of start moving beyond the kind of settings and the kind of methods where you can be face to face with every subject of your research. And then a very obvious one are surveys, which sometimes is funny because people are not sure, are these qual, are these quant, because obviously it depends on what you're asking in those surveys. But I'm kind of a big fan of surveys. I think they're also very risky because as soon as you present back percentages, oh, X% of people said this, people suddenly take it as gospel when it's like really, I think of surveys mostly, and some people will get mad at me about this, but I think of surveys, you're shouting a couple of questions into like a full crowded room. Some people will understand it, some won't, and then some raise their hands, and then you count the hands. Or that to me is like basically what a product survey is like. They're obviously, they're great folks who do polling research and all these things where you have very mature instrumentation, very mature methodologies. But when I run surveys, I want basically to get a sense for, are these things that I have a hypothesis that they exist or that we've seen in user testing or whatever, and I want to get that basically. I want to get a bit more confidence around how prevalent they are in a certain population, and then usually kind of I keep that as my mental heuristic. Then I think the next like heuristic of methods, the class of methods, I think is all around like visualizing or measuring traffic without having to write your own code, basically, right? Without having your own data warehouse and all these things. And I think kind of when you're like, if you just have a website, things like session replays come to mind. Descriptive analytics maybe might come to mind. What like heat maps, that kind of thing, which I think is often especially preferred by UX folks for the obvious reasons that you work with designers who find that more actionable maybe than just some grand statistics on general audience characteristics or whatever. And I don't know, like I personally really like, and it might be a personal thing, but I really like working with and on A/B tests. I mean, traditionally, I don't think you would class that as quant UX, but I think why not? You might need some help depending on what the product is, what the instrumentation is, etc., to execute one and work on that. But I think as a user researcher, especially as a quant user researcher, you should be all over at least the hypothesis generation and the kind of the analysis. What does it mean? How does it map with what else we know about the users? So I think you should be all over that, even though you might not be able to execute that just by yourself. Yeah, there are probably like a bunch more methods that I'm not thinking about right now. But that's, I think, the groups of things, watching behavior or visualizing behavior in certain ways, getting opinions and attitudinal information via self-report. And then, yeah, like A/B testing, I think, is a bit of an outsider.
That's fascinating. So, talk me through, Ben, some of the different types of data that you collect through the different methods you just talked about.
So I think that this comes back to what I said earlier about like how we think about humans, right? Like at the end of the day, humans are pretty damn complex, and there are many different angles you can take to learn about humans. I think in general, we probably start either on the experience level, right? So we kind of have maybe some experiential data, and by that I just mean we have observed something anecdotally ourselves. We've seen something in the lab where we have like very rich data, which has very high bandwidth, but is very, very cumbersome to kind of aggregate and use, right? I can experience almost everything in a user test, but I cannot really efficiently run like 10,000 user tests. So the data there is like very, very, very rich and very, very heavy. Then on the other end of the spectrum, which is often, when we're thinking about the business context, and we're talking about like a retention metric, right? To me, that also is human data, because most of the business metrics, if we have a human-centric business that has customers, basically, then the metrics are basically what people do on aggregate, right? Retention is whether or not people open the app up in a certain time frame. So it's loads and loads and loads of human experiences, but they're counted, they are abbreviated, they're kind of compressed into these like binary data points that are very low on bandwidth, very low on context, but they are super fast and easy to process. And that's the trade-off. And I think, and this is maybe a bit of an aside, but I think that is where, to me, most of the bang for the buck is when you are starting to look into, quote unquote, quant user research. And literally in anything within product insights is to understand how these dots connect. Because I think, and you'll have seen this. I think most of the listeners will have experienced that. There's this schism in the industry, right, where kind of you are on the qualitative side, where you really care about the individual experience, right? You care about making a good experience. You care about users telling you about pain points they have. And then there are these like business stakeholders, right? And all they care about is like the money and these weird like metrics that I don't understand. And from the other side, obviously, that looks exactly the same, right? Like we have this like important business case here, and then there are people telling me about the color of the button not being pretty enough. And I think the problem there is just like that we don't do that translation enough of thinking, okay, we have this experience of this person sitting on a train, right? And they're kind of putting the headphones in, starting to listen to Spotify. Cool. Okay. Now there are a couple of other people in that same compartment. They're all like, some of them are doing the same thing. And we zoom out a bit further, and maybe we see like 1,000 people or 10,000 people. Some of them are doing this, some of them are doing that. Like a lot of them are commuting. They have their phones in their ears. And slowly we're moving, upwards in perspective, and we're getting to the point where if all these people are facing a similar experience or a similar issue, that would maybe make an impact on, Spotify's DAU numbers. So there are these connections between metrics and the rich human level, but there are all these like translation points that I think are really, really important to learn about and just kind of to think about more. And yeah, and I think this brings us back to I think the meat of your question, right? Like the different data types. Because I think if you look at the different data types, like classically that you would think about like self-report data points where people say something, and then you can either like count that in some way, or you don't just have it individually as like individual expressions. You might have behavioral data points, which is like the vast majority of all the data. When we think about data, that's usually behavioral logs being captured by an app and then aggregated. But then there are all these like interesting, I think, edge cases or crossovers. So, like for example, if I'm doing a user test, right? If I'm sitting with like five users, and I'm observing that most of them are struggling with an issue on the onboarding, say. And then they're also talking about that, and I'm understanding from what they're saying and how they're behaving. Okay, they're confused. Maybe there's an unclear interaction, unclear affordances, or whatever. So now I'm having both behavioral data points on task failure, basically, right? Like binary, yes or no, did they complete the task? And I can make that more fine-grained. Did they clear that hurdle? Did they clear that hurdle? And then I have more of the kind of qualitative self-report observational type of data points. And now with these, I can then obviously do very different things. And I think that is, and now I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but I think that is something that people often don't neatly enough, like separate not enough. And I think that's an actually really big issue with a lot of user research being done, is that people confuse what you can do with different types of observations from a user testing session. So if like one person out of five, cannot do the thing that we think they should do, like I would be absolutely comfortable escalating that. It's the same as a bug, right? Like we don't want to see that ever. And if we see that in 1 out of 5 people, the chances that we will never see that again is like really, really low. right? Like the stats are that it would probably be happening between like 20 and 80% or something outside of the population. So we should take that seriously. So when people say, oh, you only tested with 5 users, that would really kind of make a strong counter argument. But as soon as we're talking about, okay, why did those people struggle? Or, what was their opinion based out of that? What was the experience? What did they feel? Some people might feel strongly about this. Some people might be like, yeah, I don't really care. Like, I'll just close the app and be on my way. So as soon as it comes to that type of data, I would be much more cautious making grand conclusions from, 1 or 2 data points, of course. So yeah, now I'm mixing a little bit in the type of data we're getting, the sample size we're getting, and what you can and can't do with it, given a certain method. But yeah, like I think that is a good example for why it pays off to know a little bit more about kind of the intricacies of this.
That's really interesting. And this, as you talk about almost the false dichotomy between quant and qual, I think it really resonates. I haven't worked with many researchers who can comfortably sit in both camps. It tends to be people specialize in one or the other. But as you said, it's a continuum. It shouldn't be this sort of false divide between those who talk to people and those who look at data points. I'm interested, just following on from that. Can you think of some particular? I mean, you sort of alluded to already, but maybe in a bit more detail, if you can, specific examples of where you used quant analysis to kind of solve a problem, overcome a pain point that you'd identified, or deal with some issue.
So you're asking basically a situation where I would specifically go for something quant rather than like do a qual piece of work. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I mean, I think as I alluded to earlier, like whenever I, so in a couple of instances, right? And I think we're getting back a little bit to kind of why these shorthand methods that we use exist, right? Why do we so often use five people user testing, 5-person user testing? Why do we so often run surveys with around like 200 to 1,000 participants? Why is A/B testing such a big deal? I think the reason there is because in product, generally we face the same issues over and over again, right? And these methods, I think, just happen to be very good bang for your buck methods for these particular instances. So we can obviously take the user research, or the discount usability testing example, where whenever you're in a situation where you don't yet know how something new will perform or what people generally think about it, I think it's very, very good to take a fishing trip basically and just like start to see what's under the surface, right? You don't need like a million sample size of 1 million to figure out, oh, okay, so there are some people that are really struggling with this bit. There are a couple of people who are extremely passionate about that part of your product, or just to start understanding people in the first place, right? Understanding their needs, etc. You can very comfortably start that off with very few people, I think. So that is with our definition of quant and qual, like not necessarily a use case where I would say go and start off with quant. But as you continue from there, as either you form more specific hypotheses where you say, hey, we're observing this in our audience, and this seems weird to me. I have a couple of ideas, and now I want to figure out whether these ideas may hold. Then you almost certainly need a higher sample size. You probably also, in most cases, might want behavioral data. Because it gets closer to where the impact is, right? And that is when people do something in your product, whether that's purchasing, whether that is like subscribing or whatever it is. And I can actually give you one, I think, very concrete, like one example from my own past where I used a particular method because I think that was the only method at that point that gave me what I needed. So what I was working in the UK at Shop Direct, I think they're now called the Very Group, and I would do a lot of usability testing, and it would usually be like middle-aged, slightly older women browsing for on a clothing website, basically mostly for like deals, like just seeing what's out there. So that was like the standard task, and I made one observation that when I asked customers to basically look for a specific like black dress, they would quite often scroll past the dress, even though it was indicated by these little like color boxes that it was available in black, right? So then I thought about that and I was like, okay, so my hypothesis here is that I think cognitively speaking, people look at the images and they don't also scan all these color boxes. So if a photo shows the dress in black, they understand, oh, it's a black dress, it's available in black. If the colors are only indicating that, but the dress on the picture is white, they might not actually process that because the pace they're going through these pages was pretty high. So I went to the kind of experimentation team, which were like fantastic people. But on that one, they were like, yeah, we have a bunch of stuff going on. We don't quite see that case being as strong. But that obviously then challenged me. And I thought, okay, how can I back this up? How can I get more evidence here? So what I did was I ran a survey, but it wasn't a classical survey where you ask people for their opinions or whatever. I ran a survey where I basically gave them the task. I told them, hey, you will see an image. I want you to count how many of these dresses are available in black. And then you'll only have this image for like 2 seconds or something. Then we did that. They got the image exposure, and then they got like a couple of options, like 5, 10, 3, whatever. And it was overwhelming that the majority of people basically counted or like chose the answer that pertained to the images of the black dresses. Almost nobody got the right answer, which kind of which they would have needed to pass the color information from. And then when I brought that back, and there was like, I think we would run these surveys with a couple of hundred customers, so also not like huge numbers, but definitely in the kind of quantifiable camp. So I brought back to the experimentation team, and then they were like, yeah, cool, this is giving us what we need. Now we trust that this has legs. And it was just one, I mean, this is a bit of an out there example, right? Because it wasn't like, this is not a method you use all the time. But I think it's a neat example of basically another thing where you just like figure out what it is that your need is and then choose the right method.
Yeah,
full stop.
that's interesting. I like that example. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, questioning kind of device type, how mobile, particularly as you said, if it's older ladies perhaps sitting at home on their phones potentially, or if it compared to people in other environments on laptops, tablets, whatever it might be. To what extent does that impact how you go about building or doing quant research, if I can put it like that? The device in question.
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have a great answer to that. I think simply because for the last like 10 years, I've mostly worked with companies that are basically 100% apps.
Right.
I mean, Spotify, as an example, has like all the properties, but like the vast proportion of the traffic comes from mobile. And I think these days that's most of the case. I think one good example from A/B testing is that you often have a big problem either way when you're testing purely on the web. Then that often brings you a couple of advantages in terms of like how agile you can be, how quickly you can release tests, etc. But you often have a much harder time figuring out, have we seen this person before, right? Like, should we put them in the control group or in the treatment group? We don't quite know because we're not sure whether we have seen them before, and that can obviously be a big problem for your research. Whereas if you have an app that has a sign up or something, that you know who these people are, or at least that they are the same person. But beyond that, no, I'm not 100% sure I have anything great to say on that.
Okay, let's go on to analysis now, Ben. So we've talked about creating hypotheses, identifying the problem, running tests. So you've got the data in various forms as we've touched on. Talk me through kind of the next steps then. How do you take that, make sense of it, clean it, analyze it, and use it as evidence?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously depends on what type of data or from what type of method, right? Like, I mean, if I have a survey, then the question is like, have I asked open-ended questions? Do I need to code those? In general, I think broad strokes, what I tend to do, and that is like, it's not only the analysis, also how I conduct a lot of my research, is I try to run small-ish pilot studies. So when I want to run a big survey, I usually run like a tiny one with like 50 respondents first, lots of open questions, because I'm a big fan of this, like go fishing first and then kind of, see what's out there and then quantify the things that are out there. So once I get to like the results of like a bigger study, bigger survey, bigger an A/B test or whatever, then I usually kind of already know quite a bit about the domain and the question and what I expect to see. So I hopefully am then fairly quickly able to tell, okay, is this something that is like supported by the data or not? Otherwise, other than that, like in terms of like concrete analysis steps, it depends a lot on. Well, here's one thing that I think actually that I feel very strongly about, that I try to always do, and I think we're as an industry are probably not doing enough, and that is always include the stage of analysis where you not only get but also visualize what level of confidence you have in the data, right? But by that I mostly mean just error margins. I very rarely see surveys out of all methods actually indicating how wide is the confidence interval here, right? When I'm seeing like 35% of people said this, or the NPS went from this to that, right? Almost never do I see a range around that shows us, yeah, we don't know exactly where the values are expected to be, but like right around in this range. That then obviously leads to all these problems down the line where stakeholders go panicking because they see, oh, it went down 2 points, whereas the error margin was like 10 points, right? So it's like, in all likelihood, just complete noise. So that is something I always do and recommend doing as soon as you're quantifying something that is not the total population of everyone you care about. Keep in mind what that means in terms of like extrapolation. If you run, and I literally mean that as soon as you do a user test with 5 people, right? If you test, like people do that all the time, that they show in user testing, they show 2 different prototypes, and then they see, okay, more people were able to complete this than that, so let's go with that. Most of the time, you shouldn't take that conclusion because it's probably just like noise because the numbers are so low. But again, as I talked about earlier, if there's even one person that fails a task, you already can say something about the statistical likelihood of how many people will fail this, right? And I think that gets ever more important the higher you go with a sample. Of course, that reaches a different level when you're running an A/B test, where you kind of need to be really, really obsessive about this, because you're looking for these tiny differences, and if you can't like prove them, then the test is inconclusive. But I think the bigger miss is because there usually people know about this, and the statistical tests used help you with that. But where I think in the kind of quant researched part of that spectrum, I think that is where people often know how to do the analysis, and they know how to compute like the averages and the percentages and all that. But they often forget that we're talking about humans and we're talking about a subset of the people we care about. And when we want to say, hey, what that means for our total audience, we really need to put that in the context of what actually we can and can't extrapolate.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I like that. And the confidence intervals is often, well, it's a phrase you don't often hear, and we probably should hear it more. I mean, that you talked there about one, I suppose, pitfall, if I could put it like that, of interpreting quantitative data. What would you say are other common pitfalls that quant researchers make, either deliberately or accidentally?
So I think that is by far the most important one. Understanding what you can and can't say based on the size of the data, so the sample size dimension, really, really important. Also, not very hard. I think they're very simple heuristics you can learn that don't need a lot of like math. I'm not a statistician by any means, any stretch of the imagination. I think the next, and it's slightly related to that, is, and again, it goes back to what I said about surveys earlier, that every method has blind spots and problems, right? And every method is good at some things and bad at other things. And I think in general, what I see, and this is usually not the people who do the research, sometimes it is, but it's usually the people consuming the research. The more it gets into the data realm, the more there are numbers and stats, the more they just blindly buy into stuff.
Right.
Whereas the potential, I'm not sure if the potential risks get bigger, but like just that chance of like completely ignoring your sense of caution is getting so much bigger. Like if you're talking to 3 users, right? You watch a couple of recordings, sure, people can overreact to that, right? They're like, oh, this one person didn't like it when you change everything. But in general, I think humans are pretty good at like, if I hear another person say something or see another person do something, like I know that that's that one person, right? Like I will probably, if I have a night's sleep, I will kind of adjust for that. We're trained to perceive and be around other humans. We don't have evolutionary development to read graphs and charts and stats. And when people like read a survey, going back to my initial example, right? I want them to think, yeah, this is like people shouting questions into a room. I don't want them to think, oh, this is like rocket science. And if this chart says 33%, then that's 33%. And if people say, yeah, I'm going to pay $10 for this, then people are going to pay $10 for this. So I think you, as the creator of this type of research, being extra diligent in conveying that sense of what can and can't this data tell us is really, really important. That also holds for qualitative research, I think. I think also qualitative research, because often they're in such a inferior position in companies, they tend to just do a lot of work to kind of play up the result of the work. But I think if you're honest and if you want to have maximum impact, I think it's really good to just be very clear about what the method you use is really strong at, what people should definitely take away, and what they shouldn't take away. So yeah, I think that is a big pitfall. And then I think there are more kind of specific pitfalls that go down into these specific weak areas of the methods, right? So I think the biggest issue with A/B testing, for example, and I think that holds for a bunch of other techniques as well, is that we spend way too much time debating what statistical parameters to use, right? Should it be like at 95% or should it be at 99%? Or am I okay using 90%? Oh my God. But nobody talks about, okay, have we actually run an AA test before to check that the data pipeline is working okay? Like 90% of the issues I've seen with A/B tests, especially in when we're talking about people having apps and more complicated products, all of the pain comes from invalid tests because of bugs, because the data wasn't captured correctly, because the tables weren't like set up in the right way. Almost like, sure, like nice if you can shave off like 2 days of analysis time at some point because you have like a new method that some stats experts came up with. But if then the team doesn't know how to work with that, then they will waste 6 weeks figuring out what to do next. So I think knowing where the impact is, where the gains are, where you should focus on, and get out of that kind of get out of that method rabbit hole every now and then to kind of check where it matters.
One thing we haven't touched on is correlation versus causation. And I'm interested, kind of, you're chuckling there, following on from your previous answer. What your views are on that and the dangers around that in terms of analysis.
Very, very embarrassed to have missed that, and I should have mentioned it actually when I talked about the different kind of data types and what methods, what is important to know about each method, because yeah, absolutely right. Almost all the data we use is correlational, right? And I'll make it very, very simple because I think everybody knows this term correlation doesn't equal causation. Almost nobody, I think, has a good intuition for that, and I've seen data scientists make those mistakes, like myself included. Absolutely, first to raise my hand, because I think our work environment so much dictates and primes us to think in terms of actionability, right? So we're seeing a data point that is interesting, so it must lead us to some sort of action. And then I think that where that mental mistake happens. So correlation obviously means two data points move together, either in the reverse direction or in the same direction, right? So we see revenue go up as we see MAU go up, for example.
And just clarify MAU for those listening.
Monthly active users. So we get more users and our revenue goes up. So is that big? and then people think, okay, yeah, sure, no, it's of course revenue is being driven by more users. Another even better example is that the NPS, so how much do people like our app, right? Like that goes up, and revenue goes up, so people buy more. Cool, right? So those things, because people like our app more, that's why they're spending more. But the reality is obviously that there are three possibilities for what could be going on here. Number one is you're actually correct. People like the app more. Maybe you've made some improvements. So they're more passionate, yada, yada, and they spend more. Great. However, it's also likely that because they spend more, they like it more, right? They're invested. Now they have like, there's like cognitive dissonance. Of course, I like this. Otherwise, why would I pay for this? Or there might be a third variable, that you have like entered a new market or you have found product market fit, or whatever that drives both people who like the app and that are likely to purchase. Right. So you should always consider that these three options are viable. And there are different ways to gauge what is causal and what isn't, but the only real way, or the gold standard, I should say, is experiments, which is why A/B tests are so important, right? Because they are the only thing that can really tell you, if I change this, then that will happen. And not only in a way where I change something and then something in the curve happens over time, because that can be masked by loads of other things like seasonality, etc. But I can literally tell if I randomly put people into different groups, and then I give that one group a change and the other group gets the same thing. The group in the change, if I see a change in the outcome metric there, then I can kind of prove causality. Bit short explained, but that is the basic gist, of course. And yes, so that is a big problem. And whenever you see any research being reported that is not an A/B test, and you read the phrase, this is driving that, or this is leading to that, be skeptical, right? Ask twice. Maybe they have done their homework. Maybe they know that that's actually what's happening. But in all likelihood, that is an an assumption, basically. And most prevalent, this is in surveys, right? Where people ask a question and then they report that as like some sort of truth connected to other data. But that's kind of why I both like surveys and I'm deeply skeptical of how they're being used, because it's a tool that you can use. It's very easy to use, very intuitive to use. But if you don't know actually, oh, there are certain assumptions we're making here, there's certain things we need to do to make sure that we're being accurate in what we report, I think you can screw up a lot.
Fascinating. Tell me how the field is evolving, Ben. So, in terms of methodological advancements or technological advancements, how is quant research, obvious things like machine learning, how is that impacting, for example, what you do and making it easier or more challenging? Talk to me about that.
So I think actually the main thing that I'm currently really excited about is what AI is potentially gonna do. I think there are a couple of startups right now. Like from a colleague of mine is building one called Arrow, where they let the AI basically conduct user interviews on your website, and then, which I find is the more interesting bit actually, the ability to aggregate qualitative, quote unquote, data. So what I mean by that is, initially I said that data that we get from user interviews and user sessions is usually very limited in one sense and very rich in one sense, right? It's very rich, but it's very heavy. We as humans have a hard time processing that at speed. We can't really run 10,000 user testing sessions. And even if we couldn't analyze it because it would just take way too much time. AI is really good at that, right? It's really good at like getting a lot of text and basically then just quickly saying, okay, here are the 5 themes, and I can actually quantify them. We counted those 5 themes in this many cases. So now suddenly you have the ability to run user testing and user interviews at scale and analyze it as if not as if it was quant data. It becomes quant data. So it can turn human qualitative conversational data into quantitative data. I mean, it's like, of course, there are a lot of pitfalls there, and I don't want to kind of say it's a done deal until I see it and I can use it, and it's kind of being proven out. But I think that is the first time that I can think of in like decades of actual method innovation, right? It's more than just a new tool. It's literally combining things that have previously not been able to combine, and it fills this gap on this like continuum that we've been talking about. So that's a potential I'm very, very excited about.
Interesting. Yeah. It seems to it seems like an obvious user case for artificial intelligence, as you say, quant research, and as you rightly said, the caveats around hallucinations and inaccuracy and all of that. Once we have to be careful with that. But following on from that, I wanted to ask you about more generally about ethics. What are the ethical considerations and responsible data collection, etc., for quant researchers?
Sure. I'm not a GDPR expert by any stretch of the imagination. I've thought quite a bit about this from a point of view of A/B testing and experimentation, because that was like a specific focus of mine for a while. And the point that I got to in that regard, so for those who might not know the questions there or the kind of debates there, but I mean, the question is basically, is it okay to experiment, right? I think there were a couple of these like cases that made the news where Facebook showed people like negative or positive like stimuli that were either more positive or more negative in emotional connotation. And then they saw that, yeah, if you flood people with negative stimuli, they will feel less good. And then people found that very outraging because, it's like manipulation, and it's like turning users into lab rats, etc. And I think it was a bit of an extreme example where I think, yes, you can definitely argue the ethics of that. But then like you can take that a lot further. You can say, is it okay to experiment at all? And I personally think, and I haven't thought about this for a while, but that was kind of the conclusion that I reached for myself a couple of years ago when that was an important topic for me, is that when you put your app out without doing any research, you have no idea what the impact is, right? So assuming that that is the ideal thing is kind of stupid. So to me, experimentation by itself is definitely not unethical at all, or research, or any of that by definition. I think it becomes unethical where you optimize for something that is not in the best interest of the person. So I'll give you one good example, right? Like kind of everybody wants to exercise more, everybody wants to eat healthier. So if an app experiments on me with the purpose of me, following an exercise routine, and it's an exercising app, I would make an argument that that is like an ethical thing, or at least an ethical acceptable thing, because the app has to kind of will change, whether they do that by some reasoned research. And I would actually rather they do that by some research driven mechanism than just by opinions of what the competitors are doing. But of course, if the same thing happens, and then we can take it to like the gambling industry, right, where the best interest is probably not the same as the one. If you ask a person like, "Hey, you're using this gambling app, do you want to spend way more money?" and they say, "Hell yeah," then I think, yeah, sure, by all means, it's an ethical experiment. So I think that is the thing, right? If you're following the same outcome that your users have in mind, or in their best, that they would say, yes, that is my long-term goal or my interest, I think you're okay to like, you should have quite a bit of leeway of experimenting how best to get there. If that is not aligned, then I think you need to ask yourself like a bunch of hard questions, basically.
Right. Tell me, Ben, what do you love about what you do? What gets you up in the morning?
I think what I personally like most, and I think that is also what has made me like go from being someone who's like heavy on the research and method side more to the kind of being a bridge between different teams and being different stakeholders, is that I really got hooked on this idea of our work being actionable, right? And that hasn't always been easy, because I also like going off on like into my rabbit hole and like figure things out academically that aren't like of much use to anyone. But really early on, like I kind of got into A/B testing and experimentation, and I really liked how it made me see that what I found in the user research, those users don't see that error message. Let's fix that. Let's run an A/B test on what that does. Oh, it made the company $4 million. And that also means it's proof that those customers now don't like, there was a meaningful impediment to the experience, right? So that loop of like figuring out what is actionable, what will change the needle and what won't, that is something that I really enjoy. And that is also why I care about method last, because that is the first thing, right? Kind of what are we trying to do? What is the user experience like? Where are there opportunities? Where aren't there? So what are the questions that answering which will get us there? And then comes the method, right? And then I want to be able to say, yeah, that should be a quant method, that should be a qual method. I don't care. So yeah, I definitely am not method expert first. I really want to drive actionable impact, and then the method comes long after.
And let's flip the question on its head now. What frustrates you about what you do?
Well, depending on the time of day, a lot. But no, I mean, I think it is to an extent the flip side, right? I think I get frustrated and sad also for other people when I see that they're lost in this like Babylonian confusion, where they kind of care about their professional perspective, and either they can see the expertise and the perspective from the other side, or they are not being seen from the other side, and they lack the vocabulary, they lack the methodology to close that bridge. So I think that is why I'm kind of coming more and more around to making that my professional purpose, like trying to really facilitate that and trying to teach designers and qualitative researchers to reach out into that direction, for a lot of different reasons. I think it's a great idea. It's like your career satisfaction is likely going up. You have something to learn. I can tell you like a bunch of examples from my own career where that was like a huge stepping stone for me, that I could move back and forth over that bridge. And here's something that I wanted to mention earlier. I think it's really, really important if you listen to this and you're like, oh yeah, but like math is not for me, right? Stats is not for me. Like all this sounds great, but it's like also sounds fairly complicated. I really love about user research, particularly that everybody kind of can pick it up. It's like, it's such a field. It's so diverse in, who gets into it. It's like, you got psychologists, you got PhDs, you got people who have done design. Like there's pretty much any profession that, you probably have somewhere in user research. And I think it's really, really easy to take a couple of steps, right, into that like direction of the scary maths and the scary statistics. If you're running, all you're doing is running user research, right? What we talked about earlier, understanding what you can and can't say after 5 users. If you are really confident with that, and if you have just like these basic concepts down, that definitely will change how you can argue for your work and how you will be seen. And then maybe you can take that next step and just like get a very basic understanding of confidence intervals and error margins. Again, not on a statistical level at all. Just like, what are these concepts? What do they mean? And then maybe the next step can be, okay, so generally with 200 people, the error margins are this big and that big. And that way, like, and I've never been a mathematical person. Like I didn't like in my psych degree, like quant was always my worst subject. But once you have that kind of view and that access somewhere, you can just keep pulling on that thread, right? And you will get there. It's like with exercise. It's not the marathon that will kind of really give you longer life and better health outcomes. It's like going from like 500 steps a day to like 1,000 steps a day. And I think that is massively, massively true as well for this area.
So, what resources would you suggest? You talked about people wanting to get into it. I was going to ask you about that, but you've kindly covered that. If you wanted, if someone came to you and said, "Oh, Ben, I want to find out more," what resources, tooling, courses would you point them in the direction of?
Sure. So I got this, finally, I got this question like a couple of months ago, and then I couldn't really find a good answer. So I started to put my own course out. It's not yet out, but I'm working on it. I'm doing one course that is basically numbers 101 for people who have zero mathematical background, basically, right? Like zero. So they don't know, like, okay, what is an average? So that kind of foundational layer, and then I'm doing a second course on top of that is more like what we talked about. It's like, okay, you have metrics, you have user experiences, how do you ladder up and down between those and those kind of topics. But then aside from plugging my own stuff, the things that helped me the most were kind of the websites from the Nielsen Norman Group and Jeff Soros Measuring Usability, or Measuring You, I think it's called now. Because both of these, I think, like Nielsen Norman being a little bit more on the kind of qualitative end of the spectrum, although they have content on the quantitative side. Jeff Soros being a statistician that also does UX. And I think they were good connection points to understand methodology in general, but also what you can and can't do around, certain numbers. Jeff Soros being the kind of expert where you can then have real confidence. Okay, if he kind of lays out the case and you can roughly follow it, you're like, okay, cool, I can talk about that in a meeting and nobody should question me. And the kind of Niels Norman Group more for like, okay, here are all the concepts on a very base level. They're also really no bullshit, which I really like.
and final question, Ben, if those people listening to this want to find out more about you, where can they go?
Sure. I guess LinkedIn is probably the easiest. I have like my consultancy website at scient.se, scient.se. But I think LinkedIn is probably the easiest. I somewhat regularly post there, like around these topics. So I think that's probably the best.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Ben. I've loved our chat, and I've learned a bunch of stuff myself. I think I'm inspired to go away and try some more quant research off my own back. So thank you for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge.
Very glad to hear that, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Understanding Users. If you enjoyed what you heard, do please like or comment wherever you're listening, and feel free to share this episode more widely. And feel free, of course, to drop me a line with any feedback via LinkedIn or my website, researchable.uk. Join me again next time when I'll be sharing some more insights from digital design professionals. Until then, stay safe and stay user-centered.